I left town for 6 days and came home to find my neighbor had erased a piece of my property that had stood longer than either of us had lived there. And the craziest part wasn't that he tore it down. It was that he genuinely believed he was going to get away with it. Looking back now, I still remember standing in my driveway with my suitcase in one hand, staring at something that didn't make sense, feeling that strange sensation you get when your brain notices a problem before your eyes can fully process it. You know that feeling when you walk into your house and a picture frame is slightly crooked and somehow you notice it instantly? It was like that, except 1,000 times worse. My name's Ethan, and back in 2021, I bought a house in a quiet neighborhood outside Cedar Ridge, Texas. It wasn't some luxury estate, just a comfortable home on a large lot with enough space to breathe. One of the reasons I fell in love with the place was the old limestone wall running along the western edge of the property. It stood about knee-high, built decades earlier by one of the original homeowners. The stones were weathered and uneven in a way that made them beautiful. Kids in the neighborhood rode bikes beside it. Birds perched on it every morning. It wasn't just a property marker. It was part of the landscape, part of the character of the neighborhood itself. According to every document I received at closing, that wall marked the property line. The survey showed it. The county records showed it. Even longtime neighbors talked about it like it had always been there. On the other side lived my neighbor, a guy named Brandon Mercer, along with his wife, Kelly. At first, they seemed perfectly pleasant. We exchanged holiday cookies. We chatted while mowing our lawns. We helped each other collect packages when someone was out of town. But over time, I started noticing something about Brandon. Everything was a competition. If someone bought a new grill, he bought a bigger one. If someone landscaped their yard, he hired a crew to redesign his entire property. It was like he couldn't enjoy anything unless it impressed somebody else. A few houses down, people jokingly referred to him as the mayor of showing off. Nobody hated him. They just rolled their eyes a lot. Then one summer he announced what he called his dream project. He was building a resort-style backyard. Those were his exact words. Resort style. He talked about it constantly. The pool, the outdoor kitchen, the covered pavilion, the giant entertainment deck. Every conversation somehow found its way back to that project. One Saturday morning while I was grabbing my mail, he walked over carrying a set of blueprints and spread them across the hood of his truck like he was unveiling plans for a new stadium. "Wait until you see this thing, Ethan," he said. "People are going to think they're walking into a 5-star resort." I laughed and told him it sounded ambitious. "Ambitious is the point," he replied with a grin. Looking back, that conversation feels different now. At the time, it was harmless. Just another neighbor excited about a renovation. A few weeks later, construction began. Excavators arrived. Concrete trucks rolled through the neighborhood. Contractors moved in and out every day. Around the same time, my company sent me to a leadership conference in Chicago. It was supposed to be a simple 6-day trip. I remember locking my front door, throwing my luggage in the rideshare, and not giving my property a second thought. Why would I? I had no reason to worry. The wall had stood there for decades. The property records were clear. Everything seemed normal. Chicago was busy. Long meetings, networking dinners, endless presentations. By the final day, I was exhausted and ready to get home. When my flight landed, and I finally pulled into my driveway that evening, the first thing I noticed was that my side yard looked wrong. Smaller somehow. I couldn't immediately explain it. Maybe the angle. Maybe the fading sunlight. But something felt off. I set my suitcase inside, walked toward the backyard, and the closer I got, the faster my heart started beating. Then I turned the corner. I stopped dead in my tracks. The limestone wall was gone. Completely gone. Not damaged. Not partially removed. Gone. In its place stood a brand new wooden privacy fence, and even without measuring, I could tell it wasn't where the wall had been. It sat several feet inside my property. For a moment, I honestly wondered if I was losing my mind. I stood there staring at it, trying to understand what I was looking at. Then anger hit me all at once. The kind of anger that starts in your stomach and climbs into your chest. Somebody hadn't just moved a fence. Somebody had erased a legal property boundary while I was out of town. And deep down, before I even walked next door, I already knew exactly who had done it. I wish I could tell you I took a deep breath and handled everything calmly, but that's not what happened. The second I realized that wall was gone, I marched straight across the property line and headed for Brandon's backyard. I could already hear music playing near the pool construction site. Workers were packing up for the evening while Brandon sat under a temporary canopy with a drink in his hand, looking happier than a man had any right to look. The second he saw me coming, I noticed something strange. He wasn't surprised. Not even a little. It was almost like he'd been expecting this conversation. "Hey, Ethan," he called out casually. "Back from Chicago." I stopped a few feet away. "Where's my wall?" His smile barely moved. "Ah, that." Right then, I knew this wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a contractor mistake. This wasn't some accident. He knew exactly what he had done. "What do you mean, that?" I asked. "My wall is gone." Brandon took a sip from his glass and shrugged. "Turns out it wasn't actually your wall." I stared at him. "Excuse me." He pulled out his phone, tapped around for a few seconds, then held the screen toward me. "Property app. Shows the boundary right here." I looked at the screen and almost laughed. It was one of those generic real estate apps people use to estimate home values. The boundary lines were rough approximations at best. Half the time they weren't even close. "Brandon, that's not a survey. Looks pretty clear to me. A phone app isn't a legal property document." "Well," my contractor agreed with me. "Your contractor isn't the county." His expression changed slightly then. Not angry, just annoyed, like I was making things difficult for him. "Look, Ethan, the wall was in the way of the deck design. We checked things out. The fence is where it belongs. The project's moving forward." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "You demolished a structure that's been there for 40 years based on a phone app?" He smiled again. "I think you're overreacting." That's the moment something clicked in my head. Up until then, I thought I was dealing with a mistake. Standing there, I realized I was dealing with entitlement. Brandon genuinely believed his project was more important than someone else's property rights. He honestly thought that if he acted confidently enough, reality would simply adjust itself around him. I left before I said something I'd regret. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that empty strip of land where the limestone wall used to stand. But underneath the anger was something else. Determination. Because one thing Brandon didn't know about me was that I can be incredibly stubborn when someone tries to bully me. The next morning, before most people had finished breakfast, I was already at the county records office. I requested every document connected to my property. Original plats, historical surveys, boundary records, easements, everything. The woman helping me looked at the growing stack of paperwork and finally asked, "Neighbor dispute?" Apparently, I wasn't the first person she'd seen with that expression on my face. By noon, I had copies of documents stretching back decades. Every single one showed the same thing. The property line ran exactly where that limestone wall had always stood. But I wanted something stronger than paperwork. I wanted evidence nobody could argue with. So I hired a licensed surveyor named Carl Whitaker. Carl was one of those guys who looked like he'd spent 40 years solving problems outdoors. Sun-weathered skin, work boots older than some cars, and the kind of confidence that comes from expertise rather than ego. When he arrived, he listened quietly while I explained everything. Then he nodded once and said, "Let's find out what the land says." For the next several hours, Carl worked across the property with equipment that looked like something from a science fiction movie. GPS units, measuring tools, mapping devices. At one point, he started searching near the area where the wall had stood. Then he smiled. "Well, look at that." Buried beneath years of soil and grass was an original iron survey pin. Then he found another, and another. Markers that had been placed decades earlier by surveyors long before either Brandon or I ever lived there. The final report arrived 3 days later. It wasn't even close. The property line matched the old limestone wall almost perfectly. The new wooden fence sat several feet inside my property. Brandon hadn't merely removed my wall. He had effectively taken part of my land. Most reasonable people would have stopped right there. Faced with certified evidence, they would have admitted the mistake and fixed it. Brandon wasn't most people. I hired a real estate attorney named Rachel Monroe. After reviewing everything, she looked at me and said, "This is one of the easiest cases I've seen in years." We immediately sent a formal demand letter. It explained the survey results. It demanded removal of the fence. It required restoration of the damaged property. We also warned him that continuing construction could increase his liability significantly. Brandon's response arrived 4 days later. One sentence. "I disagree with your conclusions." That was it. No evidence. No survey. No explanation. Just arrogance wrapped in a single sentence. Rachel actually laughed when she read it. Well, she said, he's making this expensive for himself. We filed additional legal actions and sought an injunction. But while paperwork moved through the system, Brandon kept building. Every day, I watched concrete trucks arrive. Every day, I watched workers expand the deck farther and farther across the area beside the fence. Sometimes Brandon would see me watching from my yard. He'd wave. Not a friendly wave. The kind of wave someone gives when they think they're winning. One afternoon, he walked over while construction crews were pouring another section of concrete. "Still chasing this?" he asked. "Absolutely." He smirked. "You know what's funny? By the time this gets sorted out, the deck will already be finished." I remember looking at the fresh concrete behind him and saying, "That doesn't mean what you think it means." He laughed. "We'll see." What made the whole situation surreal was how many opportunities he had to stop. Every step of the way, someone could have told him to slow down. His wife, his contractor, his attorney if he had one, anyone. Instead, he doubled down again and again. It became obvious that this wasn't really about land anymore. It was about pride. Brandon had publicly committed himself to being right, and now his ego wouldn't let him retreat. Weeks passed. Construction continued. The giant entertainment deck finally neared completion. Neighbors walked by and admired it. It looked impressive, I won't deny that. Massive concrete surfaces, expensive finishes, custom seating areas. Brandon strutted around like a king showing off a newly built castle. But every time I looked at it, I saw something different. I saw evidence. I saw liability. I saw a future demolition project waiting for the right court order. Then the hearing date arrived. Rachel and I entered the courthouse carrying organized binders filled with surveys, records, photographs, expert reports, and legal filings. Across the room sat Brandon. He looked completely relaxed, almost amused, like he was attending a minor inconvenience instead of a legal proceeding that could cost him a fortune. Then I noticed what he had brought as evidence. A few printed screenshots. Screenshots from the same property app he'd shown me months earlier. And in that moment, sitting there watching him arrange those papers on the table with total confidence, I had a feeling this story was about to take a very expensive turn for my neighbor. The hearing itself lasted less time than I expected. Honestly, after months of frustration, paperwork, surveys, attorney meetings, and sleepless nights, I thought there would be some dramatic legal battle stretching across multiple days. Instead, it felt more like watching reality catch up with a man who had spent too long pretending reality didn't apply to him. The judge started by reviewing the certified survey. Then she reviewed the historical property records. Then she examined the photographs showing the original limestone wall before it was demolished. Throughout the process, Rachel calmly walked through the evidence piece by piece. There was no theatrics, no grand speeches, just facts. Meanwhile, Brandon's entire defense rested on those printed screenshots from a consumer real estate app. At one point the judge actually paused, looked down at the papers, then looked back at him. "Do you have a licensed survey contradicting the plaintiff's survey?" she asked. "No." "Do you have expert testimony?" "No." "Do you have any official county records supporting your claim?" "No, Your Honor." But the property application clearly indicated. The judge held up her hand before he could finish. The silence that followed felt enormous. I glanced over and saw Brandon's confidence starting to crack for the first time. It was subtle at first. His shoulders stiffened. His jaw tightened. The smile disappeared. Then came the ruling. The judge found that Brandon had unlawfully removed a boundary structure located on my property, trespassed beyond the legal property line, and continued construction despite receiving notice and legal warnings. What happened next was the part nobody in the courtroom seemed to expect except maybe Rachel. The judge didn't simply order compensation. She ordered restoration. Every inch of the encroaching deck built within the disputed area had to be removed. The wooden fence had to come down. The property line had to be restored to its original condition. Most importantly, Brandon was required to hire a specialized masonry contractor to rebuild the historic limestone wall as closely as possible to its original appearance. Then came attorney fees, survey costs, court expenses, additional damages. By the time the numbers started adding up, Brandon looked like someone had drained all the color from his body. Outside the courthouse, he finally approached me. For a moment I thought maybe he was going to apologize. Maybe months of arrogance had finally given way to common sense. Instead, he stared at me and said, You really couldn't just let this go? I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, but because I couldn't believe he still didn't understand. You tore down my wall while I was out of town, I told him. You took my property. Then you ignored every chance to fix it. You didn't leave this alone either. He shook his head and walked away without another word. A few weeks later, the demolition crews arrived. I won't pretend I enjoyed watching another person's money disappear, but I will admit there was something strangely satisfying about seeing jackhammers break apart the very concrete Brandon had been so proud of. Day after day, sections of the massive deck disappeared. The fence came down next. Then the reconstruction began. Skilled masons spent weeks carefully rebuilding the limestone wall. They matched the style, the height, even the weathered appearance as closely as possible. The first morning I walked outside and saw that wall standing where it belonged again. I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Peace. Not victory. Not revenge. Just peace. The neighborhood talked about the situation for a long time afterward. Some people thought Brandon got exactly what he deserved. Others felt the punishment was excessive. A few believed both of us should have found a compromise somewhere along the way. Maybe that's why this story still comes up whenever neighbors discuss property disputes around here. Everyone sees it a little differently. As for Brandon, he stopped showing off after that. The giant backyard resort was eventually finished, but somehow it never seemed nearly as impressive once everyone knew what it had cost him to get there. Looking back now, the biggest lesson wasn't about property lines or courtrooms. It was about entitlement. The moment someone starts believing their goals matter more than everyone else's rights, they're already heading toward trouble. Sometimes that trouble arrives slowly. Sometimes it arrives in the form of a judge with a certified survey sitting on her desk. So now I'm curious what you think. If you were in my position, would you have taken your neighbor to court, or would you have tried to work out a deal after the wall was destroyed? And do you think Brandon got exactly what he deserved, or was the court's ruling too harsh? Let me know down in the comments. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your own experiences with difficult neighbors. Trust me, after everything that happened, I'd love to hear them.